Welcome everyone to a special episode of Dark History. As part of our third instalment in this year's spooky season special series, we're exploring a topic that's as morbid as it is fascinating: funerary rites throughout history. And to help us unravel these dark traditions, we're thrilled to welcome back a friend of the show, an esteemed author, Leon McAnally. Together, we will dig deep, pun most definitely intended, into London's iconic magnificent 7 cemeteries, uncovering the stories that lie beneath. Without further ado, welcome back, Mr. Leon McAnally.
Hello everyone. Hello Rob, thank you for having me. It's nice to be back. I wish we could have done something sooner, but I've been very busy with the publication of my book and hosting a few book signing events at a few of the places that feature in my book. But I'm really glad that we have arranged this spooky season special about funeral rites, as I found the Victorian period most interesting when writing about the magnificent 7 cemeteries in London.
So, Leon, today we're diving into the topic that's a bit macabre but endlessly fascinating: funerary rites throughout history, and some of the most chilling stories from the big 7 cemeteries of London. It's going to be a wild ride.
Absolutely, Rob. Death rituals have been a crucial part of every culture from ancient times to today, and London cemeteries are packed with history and haunting tales. The Victorians, in particular, were obsessed with death, which is why these cemeteries have such a rich and eerie history. Let's start by exploring how funeral rites have evolved through the ages.
Yeah. Let's roll back the clock. Way back. One of the earliest known burial practices dates back to the Neolithic period, around 10,000 years ago. Back then, people buried their dead in communal graves called cairns, long barrows, or dolmens. These were often covered with earth and stone, signifying that even in prehistoric times, humans had the sense of reverence for the dead. They would also include grave goods like tools, beads, and pottery, indicating a belief in the afterlife.
Right. And we move forward to ancient Egypt. The funeral rites become even more elaborate. The Egyptians believed in a complex afterlife, and that's why they mummified their dead. It was a way of preserving the body for the journey into the next world. The rich were buried with everything they might need in the afterlife, from food and jewellery to servants in the form of habit figurines. The construction of grand tombs like the pyramids, reflecting their beliefs about death and resurrection.
And then there's ancient Greece and Rome. They also had strong emphasis on funerary rites. Greeks believed that proper burial was essential for the soul's journey to the underworld. They had 3-part funeral ceremonies: laying out the body, a procession to the grave, and the burial itself. Offerings were left at the gravesite, and they believed that improper burial could leave a soul restless, wandering as a ghost.
And in Rome, funerals were almost theatrical. Wealthy families would hire professional mourners and musicians to accompany the body to the tomb. The Romans also practiced cremation, and the ashes were stored in urns. Funeral clubs were quite popular among the lower classes. Members would pay dues throughout their lives to ensure that they got a proper send-off.
Moving into the medieval period, funeral rites became more intertwined with religion, especially Christianity. The focus shifted to the soul's journey to heaven, hell, or purgatory. Bodies were often buried in churchyards, and grave markers became more common. The medieval church held a lot of control over death rituals, which included prayers, masses, and even the belief in indulgences to reduce time in purgatory. And that brings us nicely into the Victorian era, which is really where London's big 7 cemeteries come into play. In the 19th century, London's population was booming, but the city's burial grounds were overflowing. The solution: the creation of 7 large cemeteries known as the Magnificent 7. Kensal Green, West Norwood, Highgate, Abney Park, Nunhead, Brompton, and Tower Hamlets.
Exactly, and it wasn't just a practical solution, it was also a response to the Victorian obsession with death and the afterlife. The Victorians had a morbid fascination with death, partly because of the high mortality rates from diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. They experience death more frequently and up close than we do today, so mourning and memorialising became significant cultural practices.
Mourning in the Victorian era wasn't just an emotional process, it was almost a social duty, especially amongst the upper classes. Queen Victoria herself set the tone for the entire nation when she wore black for over 40 years after the death of Prince Albert. Mourning dress was strictly codified. Black clothing, veils, mourning jewellery made from jet or even hair of the deceased. And it wasn't just a matter of weeks. Mourning could last years, with different phases dictating what could be worn.
Yes, and the Victorians turned mourning into a form of art. There were specific mourning customs, from keeping the house in a dark, sombre state to covering mirrors with black cloth to prevent the deceased spirits from being trapped. Even the clocks were stopped at the time of death, symbolising that time had ended for the departed. It's this fixation with death that's so deeply etched into the Victorian mind, influenced not just how they buried the dead, but how they lived alongside their memory.
And this is why cemeteries like Highgate or Brompton became more than just a burial place. They were like outdoor museums, filled with symbolism. The Victorians loved to use symbolism on their graves. Broken columns represented a life cut short. Angels symbolised divine guidance, and the hourglass with wings reminded visitors of the fleeting nature of life. Every tombstone, every statue had a meaning, a story to tell. The Victorians also had a fascination with Egyptians, which fueled a period of Egyptomania, when many Victorians used architecture and symbols of the Egyptians in their architecture of their tombs and graves.
I actually wrote about a magnificent tomb known as the Kilmorey Mausoleum for a book, A Guide to Dark Attractions in the UK, that features some astonishing architecture of the Egyptians. It was actually used to accommodate the mistress of the second Earl of Kilmorey, Francis Jack Needingham. The Victorians also introduced the concept of the death photograph or post-mortem photography, which seems strange to us now. Families would dress the deceased in their best clothes and pose them as if they were still alive, often with living relatives in the same shot. This was sometimes the only photograph ever taken of a person, a final memento that was treasured by grieving families.
Another significant aspect of Victorian funeral practices was the elaborate nature of their funerals. Funerals became grand public spectacles, especially for those who could afford it. Coffins were richly decorated, often with brass handles, velvet lining, and elaborate carvings. Horse-drawn hearses, with black horses adorned with plumes, were common sights, and the size of the funeral procession was often seen as a marker of the deceased's status in life.
But this obsession with grandeur and ritual had a dark side too. The cost of funerals could plunge families into debt. Funeral insurance was born out of this era because no one wanted to be seen as giving a pauper's burial to their loved ones. And this is where we see the darker aspect of Victorian society, the sharp divide between the wealthy and the poor even in death. While the wealthy had elaborate tombs and private plots, poor were often buried in mass graves, sometimes with no marker at all.
As we move towards the end of the Victorian era and into the early 20th century, we start to see a gradual shift in attitude towards death. The World Wars brought death closer to everyone's lives again, but the sheer scale of loss led to more muted forms of mourning. The mass casualties made it impossible to hold on to the individual, elaborate mourning customs of the Victorian era. Memorials and monuments to the war dead became a new form of collective mourning, marking a shift in how society dealt with grief.
The 20th century also saw a rise in cremation as an alternative to burial, partly because of land scarcity and because of changing religious and social attitudes. The first crematorium in the UK opened in 1902, but it wasn't until after World War II that cremation became more widely accepted. By the 1960s, cremation had overtaken burial in the UK as the preferred option, marking a significant departure from Victorian values.
Yes. And with this shift came a change in how we remember the dead. The rise of cremation meant fewer physical monuments and more memorial gardens or scattering ashes in places that had personal significance. This more personalised approach reflects today's emphasis on celebrating life rather than focusing solely on the sombre aspect of death.
And now in the 20th century, funeral rites have continued to evolve. We see a growing trend towards eco-friendly burials, like natural burial grounds where bodies are buried in biodegradable coffins, returning to the earth in a more organic way. There are even green funerals that emphasise low environmental impacts, avoiding embalming fluids and using sustainable source materials.
Technology has also influenced modern mourning practices. Online memorials, virtual funerals, and even digital avatars of the deceased are now part of how people cope with loss. Social media allows for public expression of grief and keeps memories alive in a way that vastly differs from the mourning customs of the past.
And let's not forget the resurgence of interest in genealogy and ancestral roots, partly fueled by DNA testing and websites that help people discover their family history. This has created a new way of connecting with the dead, often leading people back to cemeteries to find the graves of long-lost relatives.
So, when we walk through places like Highgate or Kensal Green today, we're not just looking at old graves. We're seeing the evolution of how society has dealt with death and loss over the centuries. Each gravestone tells a story of not just the person buried there, but of the era in which they lived, the beliefs they had, the beliefs they held, and the rituals that marked their passing.
It's a fascinating, albeit eerie, timeline of human history, from the grandeur of Victorian funerals to the quiet simplicity of today's memorial services. Funeral rites have always been a reflection of our deepest values and fears, and when it comes to the big 7 cemeteries of London, those stories are quite literally written in stone.
West Norwood Cemetery, established in 1837, is one of the most architecturally impressive of the Magnificent Seven. Known for its stunning Gothic tombs, intricate mausoleums, and vast networks of catacombs, this cemetery is sometimes referred to as the Millionaire Cemetery, because of the high number of wealthy and influential people buried there. As you wander through, you can't help but notice the sheer scale and grandeur of the tombs, each one vying for attention, a final statement of status, even in death. But beneath the surface of all this opulence lies a darker, more unsettling history.
One of the most eerie aspects of West Norwood is the extensive catacombs. Unlike other cemeteries, which primarily use catacombs for private family burials, Norwood's crypts were designed to hold hundreds of coffins in neat rows, stacking several high. The Victorians had a fascination with these underground burial chambers, viewing them as a prestigious and hygienic alternative to traditional graves. However, these catacombs would later take on a far more sinister role during one of the darkest periods of modern history.
During World War II, London was under constant threat from the Blitz, with nightly bombing raids that turned much of the city into rubble. People were desperate for shelter, and many of London's underground spaces, including the catacombs at West Norwood, were repurposed as makeshift bomb shelters. Imagine the scene: hundreds of Londoners huddled together in the pitch black, seeking refuge among the rows of coffins, the remains of the long dead silently watching over them.
It's chilling to think about these spaces, designed as peaceful resting places for the dead, were suddenly filled with the living, terrified of the bombs exploding above. The claustrophobic labyrinth nature of the catacombs made them feel like a tomb even for those who were alive, and the air down there was thick, musty, with the smell of old wood and decay seeping from the aged coffins. The echo of bombs above only added to the sense of being trapped in a graveyard, waiting for death to strike.
There are numerous reports from the time of people hearing strange noises in the dark, whispers, soft cries, and even the sounds of footsteps, when no one else was moving. Many believe these sounds were not just the product of fear and anxiety, but something more supernatural. Witnesses spoke of feeling sudden chills, even when the space was crowded and should have been warm. Some even claimed to see faint apparitions moving through the catacombs, shadowy figures that would appear for just a moment before fading back into the darkness.
One of the most famous enduring ghost stories from West Norwood is that of the Black Nun. She is often seen near the entrance to the catacombs, her dark, mournful figure slowly pacing as if she's searching for something or someone lost to her forever. According to the legend, the Black Nun is the restless spirit of a woman who lost her entire family to illness in the mid-19th century. Overwhelmed by grief, she spent her final years in mourning, visiting the graves of her loved ones daily until she too succumbed to the illness.
It's said that she was buried in West Norwood near her family, but her spirit never found peace. Visitors who encounter her describe an overwhelming sense of sorrow and despair that seems to hang in the air around her. Some have reported feeling physically weighed down, almost as if her grief was pressing down on them, making it hard to breathe. She's often seen at twilight, her form partially hidden by the shadows of the mausoleum, her face obscured beneath a dark veil.
It's not just the visuals that unsettle people. Witnesses describe hearing faint sobbing or soft whispers that seem to echo through the catacombs whenever she's near. There's a pervasive feeling that the Black Nun's sadness is so profound that it has become part of the very fabric of the cemetery. It's as if her grief, unending and undiminished, continues to haunt those who dare to intrude on her internal vigil.
The atmosphere in West Norwood's catacombs is undeniably eerie, even without the ghost stories. The dim lighting, the rows of aging coffins, some of the glass panels revealing the skeletal remains inside, create a deeply unsettling experience. During the war, there were stories of people who would wake suddenly in the dark, convinced they felt someone standing over them, only to find no one there. Others claimed to see faint lights or orbs hovering near the crypts, strange and inexplicable in the absence of electricity.
There's one particularly chilling account from a survivor of the Blitz who described seeing a spectral figure in a long, dark robe moving silently among the coffins. He initially thought it was another shelter seeker, but when he called out, the figure turned, revealing a hollow, eyeless face, and then simply vanished into thin air. This story, like many others, fueled the belief that the spirits of the dead were disturbed by the living, their rest interrupted by the intrusion of war.
War also caused physical damage to the cemetery, with bombs occasionally striking close enough to dislodge coffins from their resting places. After one particularly heavy raid, workers found that several coffins in the catacombs had been broken open, their contents exposed to the damp earth. The idea of being surrounded by shattered remains of the dead, alongside the fear of further bombing, must have been a nightmare for those seeking shelter there.
And these wartime stories that add another layer of haunting to West Norwood. It's not just a cemetery with Gothic tombs and historical significance. It is a place where the past and present collide in a way that few other locations experienced. The living and the dead shared space during the time of unmanageable fear and uncertainty, creating a unique and unnerving legacy.
Today, West Norwood is still an active cemetery, but it's also a place that holds on to its ghosts, both literally and figuratively. The catacombs remain closed to the public, except for special tours, but their reputation as one of the most haunted parts of London's cemeteries endures. Even now, visitors report feeling uneasy, as if the spirits of those long gone are still keeping watch.
Whether it's the Black Nun, the echoes of wartime trauma, or the countless other spirits said to roam these grounds, West Norwood is a reminder that cemeteries are not just for the dead, They are spaces where history, memory, and the supernatural coexist, each layer telling its own story of human fear, loss, and the desire for eternal rest.
Highgate Cemetery is perhaps the most famous of the Magnificent Seven, known not just for its stunning Gothic architecture and overgrown, atmospheric setting, but also for the tales of the supernatural that have made it a staple of London's dark folklore. Established in 1839, Highgate quickly became the most fashionable burial ground of its time, attracting the wealthy elite who wanted to be laid to rest in its scenic woodland landscape. The cemetery is divided into two parts. The East Cemetery, where famous figures like Karl Marx and George Eliot are buried, and the West Cemetery, known for its elaborate Victorian tombs, winding pathways, and the eerie Egyptian avenue and circle of Lebanon.
Highgate's allure comes not just from its famous residents, but from its almost otherworldly atmosphere. As you walk through the West Cemetery, you're surrounded by towering obelisks, crumbling mausoleums, and angel statues draped in ivy, giving the place a feel that's more akin to a haunted forest than a typical cemetery. It's easy to see why Highgate has inspired countless ghost stories, including one of the most infamous urban legends of the 20th century, the Highgate Vampire.
The Highgate Vampire story is a bizarre mix of urban legend, media frenzy, and mass hysteria that gripped London in the 1970s. It all started when reports began to surface of a tall, dark figure with piercing red eyes seen roaming the cemetery at night. Witnesses described a chilling presence that would leave them feeling an intense sense of dread, as if they were being watched by something not of this world. Some claimed to have seen strange flickering lights hovering among the graves, or shadowy figures that vanished as soon as they were approached.
The sight of the vampire-like figure sparked a media sensation, fueled by reports in local newspapers and television broadcasts that whipped up public fear. Two figures in particular became central to the legend: Dave Varant and Sean Manchester, both self-proclaimed vampire hunters who took it upon themselves to investigate the mysterious happenings of Highgate. The two men engaged in a highly publicised rivalry, each claiming that they alone would defeat the vampire haunting the cemetery.
This rivalry escalated into bizarre public antics. Manchester claimed that the vampire was an ancient undead nobleman brought to England from Eastern Europe in the 18th century, while Ferrand was arrested at the cemetery with a wooden stake and a crucifix, leading to widespread media coverage. By this point, the legend had reached fever pitch, and the cemetery became overrun with amateur vampire hunters who descended on Highgate, determined to drive a stake through the heart of the supposed dead. The chaos peaked on a single night in 1970, when dozens of hunters gathered outside the cemetery gate, wielding stakes and holy water, in a surreal scene that was more reminiscent of a Hammer horror film than real life.
What's fascinating is how quickly the story spiraled out of control. Reports of graves being damaged, bodies being exhumed, and impromptu accidents was held by candlelight turned Highgate into a battleground between the living and the supposedly undead. To this day, no concrete evidence of a vampire was ever found, but the legend persists, bolstered by the eerie atmosphere of the cemetery itself. Some visitors still claim to feel a cold, unnatural chill near certain tombs, as if the Highgate vampire might still be lurking in the shadows.
But the vampire isn't the only ghostly figure said to haunt Highgate. One of the most spine-tingling tales is that one of Swain of Highgate, a tragic figure who allegedly took his own life after being jilted by his fiancée. His story dates back to the 19th century, when he was found hanging from a tree near his grave, heartbroken and unable to face life without his love. To this day, visitors report seeing a phantom figure hanging from the same tree, gently swaying in the breeze. Those who approach often describe a sense of overwhelming sadness and despair. only for the figure to vanish before their eyes.
Then there's the story of the mad old woman, a spectral figure often seen wandering aimlessly among the graves, clutching a tattered shawl and muttering to herself. Legend has it that she's the ghost of a woman who lost her mind after her children died of tuberculosis in the 1800s. She spent her final years living in a shack on the edge of the cemetery, refusing to leave the place where her children were buried. Those who have encountered her ghost describe a feeling of deep, unsettling grief, as if they're witnessing a woman internally trapped in her own sorrow.
Highgate is also home to the Lady in White, a classic ghostly figure dressed in a flowing white gown, who is often seen gliding between the tombstones. She's believed to be the spirit of a Victorian woman who died of a broken heart after her husband's untimely death. Sightings of her have been reported for over a century, usually around dusk or in the early hours of the morning when the cemetery is shrouded in mist. Witnesses describe her as appearing almost translucent, her form shimmering in the low light, before fading away completely.
Another unsettling report of Highgate is that of the Screaming Spectre, believed to be the spirit of a man who was buried alive. In the 19th century, before the advent of modern medical techniques, there was a real fear of premature burial, and Highgate was no stranger to such incidents. The story goes that a man was mistakenly pronounced dead and buried, only to wake up in his coffin, screaming for help. By the time his cries were heard and his grave exhumed, it was too late. To this day, visitors claim to hear faint, disembodied screams echoing through the cemetery, especially near the area where his grave once stood.
And let's not forget the infamous Highgate Shadow, a dark, featureless figure that is often spotted near the entrance to the Egyptian Avenue, one of the cemetery's most iconic and eerie features. The Egyptian Avenue, with its ancient-looking columns and mausoleum, feels like something out of another time, a gateway to the underworld. The shadow is said to lurk in the darker corners of this area, occasionally glimpsed out the corner of an eye, and disappearing when looked at directly. Those who see it often report a sense of imminent danger, as if they're being watched by something malevolent.
Highgate Cemetery's reputation as one of the most haunted places in London is well deserved. It's a site where the past feels ever present, where every winding path and overgrown tomb tells a story of love, loss, and lingering spirit. The sense of decay and abandonment only adds to the haunting atmosphere, with nature slowly claiming the once grand monuments, giving the impression that the dead themselves are pulling the cemetery back into their embrace.
Whether it's vampire legends, the ghostly apparition, or the chilling cries of those long gone, Highgate remains a place where the veil between the living and the dead feels especially thin. It's a reminder that cemeteries are not just resting places for bodies, but they're also repositories for the fear, hopes, and the stories of those who came before us. And at Highgate, those stories are far from silent. Alright, Leon, we're diving into a place that's lesser known than the famous Highgate Cemetery, but arguably just as fascinating, Tower Hamlets Cemetery. You've walked through this before, right?
Yeah, a couple of times. It's one of those places that gets under your skin. You don't get the grandeur of Gothic excess of places like Highgate or Kensal Green, but that's what makes it unique. It's quieter, but there's this underlying sense that the past is still very much alive there.
It's definitely got a different vibe. More understated, but no less haunting. Let's go back to the beginning. Tower Hamlets Cemetery, or as it was known originally, the City of London and Tower Hamlets Cemetery, was opened in 1841, and it was part of the Magnificent Seven Cemeteries. This was a group of cemeteries built to deal with London's overcrowded churchyards during the Victorian era.
Yeah, and back then London was expanding rapidly. People were dying in droves from diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. The East End especially was packed with the working class and poor, living in some pretty grim conditions. Tower Hamlets, their final resting place. Over 350,000 burials took place there, mostly for those who didn't have the means for elaborate funerals. It's a real working class cemetery.
That's what gives it such a different character from the other cemeteries. The monuments are smaller, humbler, but that doesn't mean it's lacking in history or drama. It's seen everything from Victorian pauper burials to blitz bombings during World War II. The cemetery even became a target during war because of its proximity to the dock.
So yeah, there's a section of the cemetery where bomb craters are still visible. It's a strange feeling to stand there and think that during one of the most intense periods of the 20th century, people were still being buried in the midst of chaos. The Blitz turned parts of the cemetery into rubble, but the city kept using it. You can see that layer of destruction still etched into the landscape.
After the war, the cemetery went into decline. Like a lot of places in East London, it officially closed for new burials in 1966. And for a while, it was neglected and overgrown. Nature started taking over the graves. Then, in the 1980s, it was transformed into a nature reserve and park. It's one of the most interesting things about it today, how nature and history have blended together there.
I think that's part of what makes it so atmospheric. The graves are covered in ivy, trees have grown up through the tombs, and wildlife has returned to the area. You walk through, and it's like you're in this forgotten corner of the city where time has blurred. The living and the dead exist side by side.
And that brings us to the supernatural side of things. Because with a place like this, where history is so deeply embedded, ghost stories are bound to surface. One of the most famous is the woman in white.
Yeah, her story's pretty tragic. The woman in white is believed to be an Victorian era mother who lost her children to illness. She's been seen wandering the cemetery at night, her figure draped in white, searching for her children's grave. Witnesses say the temperature drops suddenly when she appears, and some have heard the sound of a baby crying in the distance. It's a heartbreaking image, but also chilling.
Absolutely. What's unsettling is that the crying isn't just a passing sound. It's often reported as a first sign of her presence. People hear it, but when they try to locate the source, it just echoes through the cemetery, leading them to the figure of this woman, who seems lost in time. And what's interesting is how persistent the story is. Locals and visitors alike have recounted similar experiences for decades.
And then there's the ghostly gravedigger. This one's less about sorrow and more about the restless march of duty. Several people have reported seeing a dark figure standing over an empty grave, holding a shovel. The sound of digging fills the air, but when they get closer, there's no one there. Some say it's the spirit of a gravedigger who never left his post, still working long after his time on Earth ended.
It's those kinds of stories that make Tower Hamlets Cemetery more than just a historical site. There's an atmosphere that seems to defy the changes around it. Even though it's a nature reserve now, it's not just about wildlife. It's about the people buried there and the imprint they left behind.
Definitely, it's easy to romanticize ghost stories, but when you're actually there, standing among the graves that have been reclaimed by nature, it feels different. You realise that this is a place where generations of people from the East End, ordinary people whose lives were marked by struggle, poverty, and sometimes tragedy. The ghost stories almost feel like echoes of that.
And what makes Tower Hamlets unique is how it exists in this in-between space. It's a cemetery, but it's also a park. People come for quiet walks, or to spot wildlife, but there is always that reminder of death beneath the surface. They've got the past woven into the landscape in such a visible way. It's not polished or sanitised.
That's what gives it its its charm, if you can call it that. It's not dressed up for tourists. You have to really look to find its stories, whether they're historical or supernatural, and I think that's why it resonates with people who visit. There's a rawness to it.
Exactly. It's a cemetery that reflects the reality of life in East London. Hard, unglamorous, but filled with resilience. And the fact that it's now a nature reserve just adds to that layered complexity. Even as the city has moved on, Tower Hamlets holds on to its past, and maybe that's why people still feel a connection to it, whether they realise it or not.
So if any of our listeners are intrigued by history and the supernatural, Tower Hamlets Cemetery is a place you need to experience for yourself, but be warned, you might leave with more than just a history lesson.
Right. Just remember, if you hear a baby crying in the dark, or the sound of shovels in the distance, maybe it's best to leave some things undisturbed.
We're going to take a little break here.
Greetings, fellow lovers of the dark and macabre. Looking for more thrilling tales of true crime and suspense?
Then step aboard the murder coaster.
I'm Krista Carmen.
And I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And every week we bring you spine-chilling and disturbing true tales of murder and mayhem.
So strap in.
Keep your hands and feet inside the ride.
And prepare for a descent into the darkest realms of true crime.
On Murder Coaster Podcast.
Murder Coaster Podcast, available everywhere you get podcasts.
Welcome back.
Kensal Green, established in 1832, is the oldest of the Magnificent Seven. It was inspired by Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, designed not just as a burial ground, but as a landscape garden for the living. It quickly became the burial ground of choice for the wealthy, famous, and influential figures of Victorian society. The cemetery is home to the graves of many notable personalities, including engineers like Isambard King de Brunel and author William Makepeace Thackeray. The rich, grand mausoleums, intricate tombstones, and expansive grounds reflect the Victorian obsession with commemoration and status in death. But Kensal Green is not without its darker side.
One of the most notorious aspects of Kensal Green's history and the London cemeteries in general during the 19th century is the presence of the resurrection men. The grave robbers who would dig up fresh corpses to sell them to medical schools for dissection. The demand for corpses in medical research was so high that these body snatchers, also known as body brokers or resurrectionists, turned grave robbing into a lucrative business. Doctors and medical students needed bodies to study autonomy and practice surgeries, but legal avenues to obtain them were limited.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a few isolated incidents. Grave robbing was a widespread issue, and London was a hotspot. Families were terrified that their loved ones would be dug up and sold to the highest bidder, so they went to great lengths to protect graves. Iron cages, known as mort safes, were placed over coffins to prevent body snatchers from getting into the bodies. Wealthier families could afford elaborate tombs or mausoleums, but poorer graves were often left vulnerable.
Some families even paid for night watchmen to guard graves during the first few weeks after a burial, which was a period when bodies were most at risk of being stolen. In Kensal Green, there are stories of armed guards patrolling the grounds at night, using lanterns to light their way through the dense fog that often settled over the cemetery. This eerie scene must have added to the already chilling atmosphere of Victorian London, with the constant fear that the dead would not rest in peace.
And speaking of chilling tales, there's a particularly disturbing story from Kensal Green, about a ghostly figure that is often seen wandering near the graves at dusk. This spirit is believed to be the restless soul of a man who was buried alive by mistake, a real fear during the Victorian era. You see, before the advent of modern medical technology, it was sometimes hard to distinguish between death and a state like a deep coma or cataplexy.
Exactly, and this wasn't just an urban legend. There are documented cases of people being accidentally buried alive, leading to widespread anxiety about premature burial. To prevent this horrifying fate, Victorians invented all kinds of contraptions. Safety coffins were designed with bells, tubes, and breathing pipes, so that if someone were to wake up underground, they could signal for help. There's even a famous patent for a coffin that included a spring-load mechanism to rise the deceased to the surface if they pulled a lever inside. It's grim, but it shows how real this fear was.
And it's these fears that often fuel some of the most unsettling ghost stories from Kensal Green. The ghostly figure seen near the graves is said to have a gaunt, pale face and wear outdated funeral attire, suggesting he is a remnant of the Victorian era. Witnesses describe feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when they see him, as if he's trying to communicate the terror of his final moment. The story goes that this man was mistakenly pronounced dead and buried quickly, as was common at the time, to prevent the spread of diseases. But days after his funeral, faint noises were reportedly heard near his grave, scratching, muffled cries, and desperate struggles from beneath the earth. By the time the grave was finally exhumed, it was too late. His fingers were bloody, and the interior of the coffin was scratched and marked with desperate clawing. To this day, the ghost is said to haunt the area, forever trapped between life and death.
That's truly terrifying, and it reflects the broader Victorian unease with the idea of death not being as final as it seemed. This fear was compounded by the rise of spiritualism in the 19th century. Many Victorians became fascinated with the idea of communicating with the dead through seances, mediums, and spiritual photography. This movement, which peaked in the mid to late 1800s, offered comfort to grieving families, but also played into the fears of the unknown.
Kensal Green also played a role in these spiritualist practices. During the height of the spiritualist craze, mediums and seance groups would often meet near or within the cemetery grounds, trying to connect with the spirits of the departed. This was a time when even respectable members of society, including scientists and prominent figures, were deeply involved in trying to prove or disprove the existence of the afterlife. Kensal Green, with its eerie atmosphere and connections to death, became the focal point of these supernatural explorations.
Let's not forget the cemetery's other strange stories, like the unexplained lights that have been reported flickering among the tombstones. Some visitors claim to have seen what they describe as will-o'-the-wisps, ghostly lights that move erratically and seem to hover over certain graves. These lights are often associated with folklore, said to be the souls trapped in limbo, leading travellers astray.
And then there's the stories of the Lady in White, a spectral figure who's often seen near one of the older mausoleums. She's believed to be the ghost of a woman who lost her husband tragically and visited his grave every day until she died herself. The story goes that she couldn't bear to be apart from him, even in death, and her ghost now wanders the cemetery, searching for his resting place. She's usually spotted around dusk, her pale figure drifting silently between the tombs, disappearing as quickly as she appears.
Kensal Green Cemetery is more than just a burial ground. It's a place where history, fear, and legend entwine. The Grandeur Tombs stand as a monument. The Grandeur Tombs stand as monuments to the Victorians' complex relationship with death, while the eerie tales remind us of the dark side of that era. Whether it's the restless spirits, the lingering fear of being buried alive, or the ghostly apparitions, Kensal Green holds onto the secrets and anxieties of the past, still haunting us today.
Abney Park Cemetery, established in 1840, and is one of London's most atmospheric burial grounds, and has earned a reputation for its eerie and haunting ambience. And what makes Abney Park particularly unique is that it was one of the first non-denominational cemeteries in London, meaning that people of all faiths, and those of none, could be buried side by side. This was a radical idea at the time, reflecting the shift in attitudes of Victorian society towards religion and death. The cemetery was originally conceived as an arboretum and educational institute, with winding paths lined by exotic trees and plants meant to educate the public about botany and nature. But over the years, neglect and vandalism have taken their toll, turning Abney Park into a tangle of overgrown vegetation, toppled headstones, and crumbling mausoleums that feel more like a haunted forest than a cemetery.
The decay of Abney Park adds to its unsettling charm. Ivy and brambles have reclaimed much of the space, nature slowly encroaching on the graves and statues, giving the cemetery a wild, untamed feel. Walking through it, you get the sense that the past is trying to pull you back, that each twisted tree and broken tomb has a story to tell, and like many old cemeteries, Abney Park is filled with its fair share of ghost stories and unexplained occurrences. One of the most unsettling chapters in its history involves a series of mysterious fires that broke out in the 1980s. These fires seem to start spontaneously, with no clear cause, igniting the patch of the cemetery's undergrowth and damaging some of the graves. Official explanation was arson, but despite investigations, no culprits were ever found, and the incidents stopped as abruptly as they began. This led to speculation and local folklore that perhaps the fires were something more than just human mischief. Some believe that the blazes were caused by the restless spirits, souls who were disturbed by the cemetery's neglect or the desecration of their final resting places. There are tales of people seeing flickering flames and hearing faint whispers just before a fire would start, as if something unseen was warning them to leave.
And then there's the story of the woman in white. There's always a story of a woman in white. One of the most frequently reported apparitions in Abney Park. This figure is often described as a spectral woman dressed in a floating Victorian gown, her face hidden behind a delicate veil. She's usually spotted gliding silently among graves at dusk, or just after nightfall, moving as if she's searching for someone or something she's lost. Witnesses describe her having an ethereal quality, almost translucent, with an air of deep sadness that seems to linger in the air, even after she's vanished.
The legend goes that the woman in white is the spirit of a Victorian widow who lost her entire family to disease and was left alone in her grief. Unable to cope with the loss, she would visit their graves every day, weeping quietly as she laid flowers on their tombs. It's said that she eventually died of a broken heart, and now her spirit continues her daily vigil in the afterlife. People who've encountered her often report feeling a sudden chill, even on warm days, or hearing the faint rustling of fabric when no one else is around. She never speaks, never acknowledges the living, just drifts through the cemetery as if trapped in her own endless mourning.
Another eerie tale from Abney Park involves the crypts and underground vaults that lie hidden beneath the overgrown landscape. During the Victorian era, some of these crypts were used to store bodies temporarily when the ground was too frozen to dig graves. Over time, as the cemetery fell into disrepair, these vaults were forgotten and left to rot. Local legends tell of strange noises emanating from beneath the earth, especially on quiet nights. Soft, mournful moans, the sound of shuffling footsteps, or the distant echoes of metal scraping against stone.
One of the most disturbing stories from the crypt involves a spectral figure known as the caretaker. According to the legend, he was a grave digger who worked at Abney Park in the late 19th century. He was known for his obsessive dedication to the cemetery, often spending nights wandering the grounds with a lantern, making sure everything was in order. But as time went on, he became increasingly isolated and strange, muttering to himself and digging graves that weren't needed. When he died, his body was never claimed, and he was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere within the cemetery.
Since his death, visitors have reported seeing a shadowy figure carrying a lantern, moving through the thick underbrush at night. Some say he's still tending to the cemetery, unable to leave his lifelong duty behind. Those who encountered the caretaker describe a sense of unease, as if they're being watched by someone who doesn't want them there. A few brave souls who followed the light have been found themselves led deeper into the cemetery's maze of graves, only for the light to suddenly disappear, leaving them lost in the dark.
There's also a curious phenomenon known as the phantom funeral procession. Several witnesses have claimed to see what looks like a funeral procession from the corner of their eye, a line of mourners in Victorian attire, following a horse-drawn hearse along one of the overgrown paths. But when they turn to get a better look, the entire scene vanishes, as if it was never there. Some speculate that this is a ritual haunting, a kind of echo from the past playing out on a loop, triggered by the cemetery's sad atmosphere.
Abney Park's spectral stories are deeply entwined with its physical decay. The overgrown landscape feels like a place frozen in time, where history and memory linger like creepy ivy. It's a reminder of the transient nature of life and the inevitability of decay, not just of the body, but of our places we build to remember the dead. Walking through Abney Park, you can't help but feel the weight of all those unspoken stories, the lives that were, the grief that remains, and the spirits that just might still wander among the graves.
Nunhead Cemetery, established in 1840, is one of the lesser known but equally captivating members of the Magnificent Seven Cemeteries. Spanning over 50 acres, Nunhead is a mix of serene beauty and haunted desolation. Originally designed as a grand burial ground for the growing Victorian middle class, it was filled with imposing monuments, winding paths, and carefully landscaped gardens. Over time, however, the cemetery fell into neglect, and nature began to reclaim it. Now, with its tangled undergrowth, leaning headstones, and eerie stillness, Nunhead feels like a place where time has stood still, a perfect setting for ghost stories and unsettling encounters.
The atmosphere at Nunhead is both enchanting and eerie. A combination of towering trees, ivy-covered tombs, and crumbling mausoleums gives it a look of a forgotten Gothic novel. The chapel, once a centrepiece of the cemetery, is now a haunting ruin, with empty windows and a roof open to the sky. This sense of abandonment has turned Nunhead into a sanctuary for wildlife, with foxes and birds now the cemetery's most frequent visitors. But the living are the only ones roaming this forgotten graveyard. Stories of ghostly apparitions have been told here for decades.
One of the most chilling tales from Nunhead is the legend of the crying child. Visitors often report hearing the faint, sorrowful sound of a child sobbing among the graves, especially near the older sections of the cemetery. The sound is described as soft and distant, almost like it's being carried on the wind, and seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. People have searched the grounds expecting to find a lost child, but no one has ever been found. The sobbing often stops abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Some say it's the ghost of a young girl who died in the 19th century from a fever and was buried in an unmarked grave, her spirit forever wandering in search of her family.
Stories like this really get under your skin, especially in a place as atmospheric as Nunhead. The sense of isolation in some parts of the cemetery, where graves are half hidden by overgrown vegetation, only adds to the feeling that something or someone might be watching. Another popular legend is the tale of a ghostly funeral procession. In the early 1900s, several witnesses reported seeing a group of mourners dressed in Victorian era clothing following a coffin through the cemetery. What made this scene so strange was that the figures appeared to be gliding rather than walking, moving silently and smoothly across the uneven ground.
The witness described the mourners as solemn and expressionless, their heads bowed as if in deep grief. They were led by a veiled woman in black, believed to be a grieving widow, and a pallbearer carrying a cross at the front of the procession. As they made their way towards one of the cemetery's shaded pathways, the entire procession seemed to dissolve into the mist, leaving no trace of their presence. Some believe this is a ritual haunting, a spectral replay of a long-forgotten funeral. It's as if the cemetery itself has absorbed the memory of that mournful event, replaying it over and over for those who are in the right place at the right time.
Another eerie phantom, often reported at Nunhead, involves the ghostly figure of a soldier, known as the Lonely Guardsman. This spirit is said to haunt the older military graves, where many soldiers from the 2 world wars are buried. Dressed in tattered uniform, the apparition appears to be in a state of constant vigilance, patrolling the rows of graves as if it's still guarding his fallen comrades. Those who have seen him describe feeling a sudden drop in temperature and an overwhelming sense of sadness, as the guardsman's duty is never done, even in death.
Some say this spectre is the ghost of a soldier who returned from the Great War deeply traumatized and couldn't bear to leave the graves of his fellow soldiers. He's seen most often at dusk, standing motionless among the graves before slowly fading into the shadows. People who have approached him claim to feel a sense of sorrow and regret, almost like they're being pulled into the guardsman's endless vigil. Is a haunting reminder of the countless lives lost to war and the enduring impact of grief.
Nunhead is also known for its mysterious lights, which appear at night and flicker among the trees. These so-called will-o'-the-wisp have been attributed to various causes over the year, from swamp gas to electrical disturbances. But for those who have witnessed them, the lights have an otherworldly quality, moving purposely and often leading curious onlookers deeper into the cemetery's dark path before suddenly vanishing. Some who have followed these lights report losing their way, as if the cemetery itself is trying to keep them trapped in the maze of graves.
And let's not forget the legend of the Nunhead nuns. Despite the cemetery's name, there's no real connection to any nuns or religious orders. However, over the years, multiple visitors have reported seeing ghostly figures in habits wandering the grounds. These apparitions are usually seen in the old chapel ruins, gliding silently among the headstones. Some speculate they're not actually nuns, but rather spirits of women buried in Nunhead, who have taken on this form, perhaps influenced by the cemetery's name and the subconsciousness of fears of those who see them.
One particularly unsettling account comes from a local historian who, in the 1970s, claimed to have seen 2 ghostly nuns standing by a grave, seemingly engaged in silent conversation. As he approached, both figures turned to look at him before vanishing into thin air. The experience left him shaken, and he avoided the cemetery for years afterwards. It's moments like these that keep the legend of Nunhead nuns alive. Spectral figures that defy explanation, caught between the living world and whatever comes next. Nunhead Cemetery, with its haunting beauty and air of decay, serves as a reminder of the importance of life and the lingering echoes of the past. Every rustling leaf, every shadowy corner seems to hold a secret, as if the souls of those buried here are still whispering their stories to anyone who dares to listen. It's a place where history and myth intertwine, and where the boundary between the living and the dead feels thinner than anywhere else.
Brompton Cemetery, opened in 1840, is not only one of the Magnificent Seven, but also one of the most architecturally stunning cemeteries in London. Designed by architect Benjamin Bode, it features sweeping colonnades, grand domes, and extensive catacombs, they give it a distinctively Romanesque feel. Walking through Brompton feels like stepping into another era, with its long, tree-lined avenues, intricately carved statues, and a central trap that looks like it could be part of an ancient temple. It's no wonder that this cemetery is not just a final resting place, but also a popular filming location and public park.
Brompton isn't just known for its beauty, it's also steeped in history. Amongst the most notable figures buried here are Emmeline Parkhurst, the formidable leader of the British suffragettes movement, and a host of other prominent Victorians, including actors, inventors and soldiers. The cemetery's grounds are filled with the stories of those who shaped the 19th and early 20th centuries, but it's also home to legends and ghost sightings that have left their own mark on the cemetery's evil reputation.
One of the most famous ghost stories associated with Brompton is that of a spectral figure often described as a Victorian woman in a long, flowing cloak. Sightings of this ghostly apparition have been reported for decades. Witnesses describe seeing her moving slowly among the tombs, sometimes appearing to search for something or someone that remains lost to her. Some believe she is the restless spirit of a woman who died tragically in a fire, her life cut short in a moment of terror, and her soul unable to find peace.
This particular ghost is often seen near the older parts of the cemetery, where the tombs and graves date back to the earliest days of Brompton. Her presence is usually accompanied by a sudden chill in the air, even on the warmest days, and a faint smell of smoke that seems to linger without any apparent source. There's something deeply melancholic about her, as if she's trapped in the endless loop of her final, tragic moments. People who see her describe an overwhelming sense of sadness, as though they're momentarily sharing her sorrow.
Another unsettling tale from Brompton Cemetery involves the so-called Tomb of the Vulnerable. This mysterious and sealed tomb is one of the cemetery's most talked about features, and its legend has grown over the years. According to local law, the tomb supposedly holds a time capsule or even a hidden treasure left by a secret society. Some say it contains a powerful relic, while others believe it's cursed and that disturbing it would unleash something dark.
The story goes that in the late 19th century, an excavation crew working near the tomb heard a strange noise coming from within. Muffled voices, footsteps, and what sounded like scratching on stone. Convinced they were hearing things, they chalked it up to their imaginations running wild. But as the days went on, the noises persisted, growing louder and more frantic. Eventually, work around the tomb was halted, and the area was cordoned off. The tomb was never opened, and it remains sealed to this day, with many believing that whatever's inside could never be disturbed.
There's also more of a supernatural angle to this legend. Some believe the tomb is a portal or gateway of sorts, connected to the occult and supernatural practices that were popular in Victorian London. Brompton Cemetery is known to have been frequented by mystics and spiritualists, and there are tales of secret rituals taking place among the tombs late at night. The Tomb of the Venerable is said to be the focal point of these ceremonies, with its imposing and mysterious facade lending an air of dark intrigue.
Witnesses have reported seeing shadowy figures around the tomb after dark, cloaked in long robes and moving in deliberate, almost ceremonial fashion. These sightings have fueled speculation that the tomb might be tied to a long-lost secret society, or that it guards something far more sinister than mere bones. The legend even caught the attention of a few paranormal investigators in the 80s, who claimed to have captured unusual electromagnetic readings and unexplainable cold spots near the tomb, though no one has ever dared or been allowed to break the seal.
Adding to Brompton's mystique is its elaborate network of catacombs, some of which are open to the public, while others remain hidden and inaccessible. These catacombs were originally designed as a cheaper alternative to traditional burial, offering a space where bodies would be interred in stacked coffins. But over time, they've become one of the cemetery's most haunting features. Visitors often report feeling uneasy when exploring the dim, narrow passages, and some have claimed to hear soft whispers and the faint rustling of fabric, as if unseen figures are moving just out of sight.
One particularly unnerving tale involves a caretaker who worked in the catacombs during the 1920s. According to the story, he would often stay late into the evening, attending to his duties and making sure the catacombs were secure. One night, he reported hearing a distant sound of footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. At first, he assumed it was just a late visitor, or perhaps a colleague. But when he went to investigate, he found the catacombs empty. The footsteps, however, continued, now accompanied by faint, disembodied voices.
The caretaker, unnerved but determined, followed the sounds deeper into the catacombs until he reached a section that was supposed to be sealed off. As he approached, the noises stopped abruptly, and he found himself standing in front of a row of ancient coffins. It was then that he felt a sudden, intense cold, and the sensation of being watched. Terrified, he fled the catacombs and never returned. He later described the experience as feeling like he had interrupted something, a hidden gathering of spirits that resented his intrusion.
To this day, Brompton's catacombs remain a place of intrigue and unease, with many visitors choosing to stay away from their shadowy depths. The combination of history, legend, and the sheer weight of loss that permeates the air makes Brompton Cemetery one of the most compelling and haunting places in London. It's a cemetery that holds a secret tightly, and every darkened corner seems to whisper of stories yet untold.
Brompton is more than just a cemetery, it's a living relic of the Victorian obsession with death and the afterlife. Its winding paths, grand monuments, and hidden catacombs tell a story of a time when death was not just an end, but a spectacle, an elaborate ritual filled with both reverence and fear.
Wow, Leon, that was quite a journey through time and cemeteries. From funerary rites to ghostly figures wandering through London's cemeteries, it's clear these places are not just steeped in history, but also wrapped in mystery and darkness.
Absolutely, Rob. These cemeteries are like time capsules, not only filled with stories of the people buried there, but also with the lingering spirits and the legends that refuse to be forgotten. Thanks so much for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure to dive into these kinds of topics with you.
The pleasure's all mine, Leon. Thank you for joining me today and sharing your insight. It's always great to have someone as passionate about these dark histories as I am. We'll definitely have to do it again sometime.
I love that. There's no shortage of eerie tales out there waiting for us to uncover.
Couldn't agree more. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you want to grab Leon's book, A Guide to Dark Attractions in the UK, you can find it on Amazon. Also, I will link all of Leon's socials in the description, along with mine as always. So with all that being said, thank you again to Leon. Thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode, as we delve into another event and more dark history.